Okay, it looks like we are live, so let me just mute my screen there. Okay, so we are live, and so let's go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everybody to the second installment of our series, Being Singular. So it's a colloquium series hosted by myself, Gregory Moss from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Alessandro De Cesaris from University of Freiburg in Switzerland. And today we are very grateful to have Brook Ziporyn with us from the University of Chicago. Uh, so I'm going to just briefly introduce Brook and then we'll hand it over to him. So Brook Ziporyn is the Mircea Eliade Professor of Chinese Religion, Philosophy, and Comparative Thought at the University of Chicago Divinity School. So he's an expert in Chinese philosophy and religion, Buddhist philosophy, comparative philosophy. He does work in ontology and metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, neo-Tiantai thought. His PhD is from the University of Michigan, and I first became aware of his work by reading Zhuangzi. I came to Zhuangzi kind of late, but coming to Chinese University of Hong Kong, I had colleagues working in Taoist philosophy. So I took advantage of that and was reading Brooks' translation. So he's a translator of Zhuangzi. I think it's the complete works. I think Hackett published it 2020. I forget what version I have, but it's definitely Brooks' translation there. Yeah, so I'll mention some. Brooke has a lot of books and articles. I'll just mention some books, especially the most recent one, what I think is the most recent one anyway. So Ironies of Oneness and Difference, Coherence in Early Chinese Thought, Prolegomena to the Study of Li. That was SUNY 2012. And then Beyond Oneness and Difference, Li and Coherence in Chinese Buddhist Thought and its Antecedents. So that was, I think, the next series in SUNY 2013. Um, Emptiness and Omnipresence, An Essential Introduction to Tiantai Buddhism, Indiana University Press 2016. And there's some others I'm going to skip. Most recently, and this is a book I'm really interested in and looking forward to diving in, is Experiments in Mystical Atheism, Godless Epiphanies from Taoism to Spinoza and Beyond, close quote. Very triggering title, very excited. So this is University of Chicago Press 2024. Yeah, so I think we're really excited to hear from Brook Ziporyn today. And let me just say the title and then hand it over. So the title is Hegel and Tiantai Buddhism on Being and the Absolute, Theistic and Atheistic Intersubsumptions of Universality and Particularity. So please, Brooke, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Greg. That was a really, really kind and generous introduction. Um, and I'm really happy to join this series. I was excited to see all the speakers you had, and I heard about this from Ben Birkenstock, I think last year. So I'm really happy to be a part of it. I sent around a piece of writing, which is actually drawn from the online supplements from the book that Greg just mentioned, Experiments in Mystical Atheism. And so I don't know if some of you may have had a chance to read that, some of you maybe not. I'm going to try to basically cover that material though. And I want to do this with a PowerPoint, which I'll basically sort of just read through, but making sort of clarifying comments when possible, and also because there's a few kind of visual aids involved that I'm hoping will be useful. So let's see, everybody see that okay? I can't see you now.
Yes, it looks good.
Yes.
We can
Okay,
see it. Thanks.
perfect. Okay, so I want to talk about this term intersubsumption I use, starting with how I see that working in Hegel and some of the limitations of it, and then do a comparison to sort of similar structures in this tradition of Tiantai Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. So again, I'm just going to start reading. I want to read the structure of singularity in Hegel as the full coinciding of universality and particularity, fully realize that same structure as the relation between substance and subject, and more generally between determination and negation. And what is that structure? The absolutely actual, or the singular in this case, is not only both subject and substance, as if they were some kind of a composite, synthetic of these two contrary characterizations. As I understand it, the point is that what it is to be substance turns out to be what it is to be subject, and vice versa. Yet without annulling their difference, which now, that difference between the two now becomes internal to each of the two. The same goes for determination and negation generally. It's not just a question of something being both determinate and a negation, but rather that to be determinate is to negate, and to negate is to determine, while maintaining the difference, in other words, ineliminably involving those two dimensions or aspects wherever either the one of them appears. And the same would go for universality and particularity. What is actual is not just characterized by both universality and particularity, right? Just it has universality, also has particularity, just joined. But rather the truly and absolutely actual occurs only where the universality is seen to be the particularity, and vice versa, following that model, while maintaining their difference, such that universality is internal to particularity as such, and vice versa. And the name I use for this sort of total identity, which is also total distinction, is intersubsumption. And I'll talk more about that in the Hegelian case and in the Tiantai case in a bit. The particular subsumes the universal just as the universal subsumes the particular, making each both universal and particular. That may sound kind of weird on first blush, but it has sort of simple roots, this structure. I always view it as going back through Fichte to the Cartesian cogito, which I would understand as, sort of reducing to a dubito, the negation of thought, the doubt about thought itself being a thought, as revealing a structure where we find something that posits itself even in and as and by negating itself. In that example, what's taken from that, as I understand it, to the substance-subject problem in Hegel, is that the negation of thought is equally its own positing, and the positing is the negation, positing as determinate. There's also roots for this in Spinoza, where that dubito structure, as I call it, reveals the structure of the absolute, what can be conceived only as existing, using the one sort of permutation of the ontological proof of the existence of God, traditional theological language, can only be what is affirmed even in being negated, like that structure of the cogito. But this applies for Spinoza not only to thought, but also to extension, and what is real is only real as a mode of this structure. Furthermore, on that basis, determination as such is negation, as we know. Hegel picks up that line from Spinoza. So all determinations are negations, and vice versa. There's another aspect to this where we have this sort of Kantian idea that all determinations are universals, that anything determinate, anything predicable will involve a category that involves universality. And the further Hegelian twist, all universals are negations, of course, of particular, on the basis of all those, of particulars, negations of other universals, and most importantly, immanently, insofar as universality as such is determinate, as it must be to be universal rather than particular at all. In other words, the universality involves the negation of itself insofar as it can be determinate qua universal, if it is to be distinguished from particularity. All particulars are negations, the other sign, of other particulars, negations of all universals, and also immanently insofar as particularity as such is determinate at all, and thus in a position to not be the universal. These two negations negate each other, and when their positing is seen as identical to their negations, we have this intrinsic intersubsumption of universal and particular, whence also the intersubsumption of subject and substance, that is spirit. And by the same token, all those kind of parallel categories, we would have the intersubsumption of finite and infinite, of determinate and indeterminate, where in each case to be either one of the two is to be both of the two. Thus, we would expect the intersubsumption of any recursive application of these terms, I claim, that is finite spirit, man, and infinite spirit, God. We'll get to when those terms pop up, since any instance of finitude or infinitude of any attribute of anything in isolation from the other cannot stand and immanently deconstructs into the other. So this one's just kind of a summing, right? We have all these parallels here, intersubsumptive, apparently opposed terms, which end up being synonyms in the sense that they reveal themselves to also include their contrasted opposite. And that relationship is what I would call true intersubsumption, a structure definitely, in my view, in Hegel, and one he shares with Tiantai Buddhism, with roots going back to chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi. Now, here's the problem that interests me today when I'm trying to compare, because it's already kind of unusual enough to have a full-blown exposition of this idea, that the sort of conclusions and implications of them are taken quite differently in these two cases, Hegel and Tiantai. This again from this recent book, I tend to locate the decisive point of difference in this question of teleology. Teleology, considered through the opposed terms ends and means, or final cause and efficient cause, should work the same way. But in Hegel, it seems to me that it often doesn't seem to, in spite of some places, for example, the good is always already accomplishing itself. I talk about this at some length in the handout that was distributed. If intersubsumption between ends and means was full intersubsumption in the sense I was just talking about, any means to an end would be revealed when thought through. That's always the premise here, right? When all the implications are taken into account, would be revealed to be the real end of what first appeared to be the end. In other words, a reversibility between means and ends, as much as, but not more than, the contrary. It's perhaps possible to read Hegel this way, particularly in his local treatment of the problem of ends and means in the category of finality, teleology, and the logic. Todd McGowan recently has written a book that takes that view. Or in terms of the convergence of ends and means in the autotelos of the category life. But I claim that in any case, even if in those local cases we do have a full intersubsumption of ends and means in this sort of notion of organism, the global structure of the system goes on to ignore the implications of this. And I think the incomplete intersubsumption of truth and illusion, or of partial truth and complete truth, is in one sense what gets in the way, and with it the full intersubsumption of finite and infinite. In other words, there's a kind of unidirectional subsumption rather than intersubsumption here. Truth subsumes illusion in a way that illusion does not subsume truth, although it may subsume truth in some sense. The same would go for Hegelian refinements on what we mean by true and false. For example, complete and partial, or explicit and implicit. There's a unidirectional assumption that seems to intervene here. And this applies all the more so with the categories of purpose and purposelessness. Purpose subsumes purposelessness, or apparent purposelessness anyway, but purposelessness does not subsume purpose. I think we see this most clearly in the handling of categories of necessity and contingency, as opposed to the categories of necessity and freedom, where I do think Hegel gives us a true intersubsumption. We can say, and this is an example in the handout, we can say that the contingency, for example, of Napoleon's appearance as a particular is fully subsumed into the necessary course of history, and that there must be a contingent event, some contingent event that would make that happen, This is the so-called cunning of reason. But as I understand Hegel, and if others have a different view, we can take that up in Q&A, but as I understand him, that same necessary course would have to obtain no matter which particular contingency accomplished it. I have an example about the Beatles and the Stones, or that we can get into, but the point with Napoleon, I think, is good enough for now. Full intersubsumption would require a very different relation between contingency and necessity. It would mean that with a different contingent trigger, as it were, we would still have a subsumption both ways with a kind of necessity, but it would not be a single necessity. It would not be a single story that always has to win in the end. It would require a different but also necessary course of history determined by each contingency. In other words, the role of the contingent as an actual determinant, as much as vice versa. Now that might seem quite a tall order, and this is what I will try to give you in the account of the Tiantai picture. So that single story, single narrative, single direction that still seems to supervene on the Hegelian system, this is not an original thought, but could well be seen as a kind of theistic inheritance that remains unsublated. Purpose should be another in the list of categories that are structured the same way as universality, subjectivity, infinity, and the rest in that list. With Hegel's idea of internal teleology, we are supposed to reach the full conversion of ends and means on the model of all the above pairs, and even more so as it's further along in the logic. As in Aristotle, both being autotelic would mean being both end and means of oneself. The two should be fully reversible, synonymous though distinct, each entailing both, intersubsumptive, and we get this in Kant's third critique too. But I would claim in Kant's case, in a different way, but also in Aristotle's case and in Hegel's case, the supposedly autotelic inner form detaches somehow, surprisingly, into a unidirectional hierarchical external telos, God or reason or spirit or idea, built into the structure of the system. What drops out here is the purposelessness and contingency, although, of course, in general, they are built into the system in some way. But they are in the system, as I just said, unidirectionally sublated rather than, if you like, intersublated, which would land us in a fully reversible intersubsumption of purpose and purposelessness, necessity and contingency. So that's repeating. And this is what I claim we will find in Tiantai, rooted not in theistic premises that are in the process of being reworked, but atheist Buddhist premises that are also in the process of being reworked in that system. I claim this final asymmetry is partially due to the lingering monotheist heritage in Hegel. I call Hegel's version compensatory intersubsumptive theism, and Tiantai's version, this should be switched, emulative intersubsumptive atheism. And those terms come from the book. I won't go, we can, if you're interested, I'll go through them in discussion. But basically, compensatory means the two roles complement each other, infinite subsuming finite rather than being fully reversible and intersubsumptive. For Hegel, they cannot change places, even though they're both really spirit. And thus, we get this idea of finite and infinite spirit. Even though spirit itself is an intersubsumption of finitude and infinity, and each remains in its own place. And we see this particularly vividly, I think, in the religious restatement among so-called right Hegelians. This is from Strauss, who later becomes a left Hegelian, but from his book, The Life of Jesus. I think this is a nice summation of how that plays out. So let me read this from Strauss. When it is said of God that he is spirit, and of man that he also is spirit, it follows that the two are not essentially distinct. And then Strauss's own brackets, it is the essential characteristic of spirit to remain identical to itself in the distinction of itself from itself, that is, to possess itself in its other, that very intersubsumptive structure. Thus, to speak more precisely, it is given with the recognition of God as spirit that God does not remain as a fixed and immutable infinite outside of and above the finite, but enters into it, posits finitude, nature, and human spirit, merely as his alienation of self, from which he eternally returns again into unity with himself. Now, that's the God side. As man, considered as a finite spirit, limited to his finite nature, has no truth. So, in the same way, God, considered exclusively as an infinite spirit, shut up in his infinitude, has no reality. That's that intersubsumption of infinite and finite. The infinite spirit is real only when it discloses itself in finite spirits, as the finite spirit is true only when it merges itself in the infinite. The true and real existence of spirit, therefore, is neither in God by himself, nor in man by himself, but in God-man, neither in the infinite alone, nor in the finite alone, but in the interchange of impartation and withdrawal between the two, and this is key, which on the part of God is revelation, and on the part of man, religion or devotion. So what's interesting there is you have a kind of doubling of finite and infinite, because spirit already is the intersubsumption of finite and infinite, and yet there's a finite version and infinite version of it. And it leads to this partitioning of these two roles: on the side of the infinite spirit, revelation; on the side of the finite spirit, religion. Now you could say this, to play Hegel's advocate. Of course, this is in the picture thinking form of religion still. So these sort of asymmetries, maybe we could understand as being worked out and annulled when we move past religion into philosophy proper, and leaving still here a legit sort of intersubsumption that preserves difference. A way of doing that by delineating finite spirit, which subsumes infinite spirit as a moment of itself, infinite spirit because spirit subsumes finite spirit as a moment of itself, a way of maintaining their separate and distinct identities. But in response to that, it seems to me that the dual teleological relation between man and God in those two different roles is now reinstated in its traditional monotheist form with respect to the unilateral functions or activities of the two sides. God reveals, man worships, because purpose remains an ultimate category. God is a purposive being whose purpose is to reveal himself to man. Man is a purposive being whose purpose is to receive and recognize and accord with the revelation from God. The apparent bidirectionality, it seems, is really just two distinct and complementary unidirectionalities. They cannot trade places or roles, which would something like man's infinitude reveals itself to God's finitude, and God's finitude worships man's infinitude, for example. And hence purposelessness is completely denied to both, as is the simultaneous embrace of these two opposite purposes, and for that matter, any other purposes for either of them, which would indeed amount to the dawn of the purposeless. There's a lot crammed in there, but leave that for now. The worry is that even when we do pass beyond religious form to philosophical form, this unidirectional teleological structure remains in place in the distinct roles of philosophy and religion themselves within the system. Philosophy's role in understanding art and religion, etc., rationally, and art and religion et alia, the roles for these things, for example, representing philosophy sensually or mythologically, are fixed and hierarchical in that same way. So that's how I see what's going on in Hegel, or kind of impasse there, and I want to see if we can move beyond that. And I propose to do so with a religious version of that, conveyed without imposing the split or one-way relation between picture thinking and rationality. We need this atheist version in Tiantai, where Buddha and sentient being are each both conditioned and unconditioned, where each reveals itself to the other, and each worships and accords with that revelation from the other. This has its base, so we're going to get some pictures in a minute, okay? Just in case this is a little heavy going. But to get to that, we need some basic Buddhist premises here. So old school pre-Tiantai Buddhism regards all universals as false overgeneralizations. The sort of Indian Buddhist scholasticism is radically, vociferously nominalist. Applies that even to alleged bare particulars. They are, this cup or, this instant even. They are false universalizations unifying a multitude of distinct moments and processes. Wherever you see a unity, wherever you are able to characterize something homogeneously. This is the famous Buddhist no-self doctrine. This concrete self, even, is a false universalization or unification, put the universal self on this series of particular events, like this moment, this moment, this moment, this moment, this cognition, this state. A little further on in Buddhist history, we have the Mahayana, which goes on to say this is true of cells, this is true of the cup, and even in Madhyamaka, that there are no particular momentary events. In other words, that these, if you break these things down to their ultimate component, nominalist sort of instantaneous points, these two end up without the benefit of these already recognized to be false universalizations, have no qualities whatsoever and need not be posited. So these momentary events are incoherent without any inherent character at all, without some kind of universals, and all universals are false. So we've reached here the point that Kant and his descendants also saw. Though they are never literally true, universals are unavoidable, cannot be eliminated. Even to deny them, we need them, right? They're really transcendental. Even to talk of bare particulars and individuals is already to universalize, to identify across moments as this, as self, as particular. All determinations are universals, and all are false, so we are doomed to falsehood. We're still in pre-Tiantai Buddhism here. Madhyamaka solution to this, sort of like the Kantian solution, we accept that inevitability of universals and their falsehood with clear knowledge that these inevitable universals cannot be ultimately true. Ultimate truth then becomes purely apophatic, or on some readings of Madhyamaka, drops out of the picture entirely, leaving only conventional truth. The Tiantai approach builds on Madhyamaka, extending it, revising it a bit, and that is to use every and any universal as a heuristic leading to its own self-overcoming, by expanding that universal's claim to absolute universality, which eliminates its determinacy on grounds similar to those we saw in the first slide. That determinacy is a negation, requires something external to itself to be contrasted to. So a truly universal ends up sacrificing its initial determinate character. So we end up with an apophasis, not by removing false universals, but by leaning into their inevitability and their imminent self-overcoming. And this allows the apophatic to converge with infinite forms of cataphasis, which is to say, positive characterizations of the absolute. Rather than trying to eliminate universals, we exacerbate them to be literally all-inclusive and omnipresent universality per se, instantiated in all things. And I should pause here to say why Buddhists care about this. There's a soteriological goal under all this, and a premise to that goes all the way back to basic Buddhism, which is that suffering equals impermanence equals conditionality, which is contrasted to the soteriological goal of the end of suffering, characterized as nirvana, which is definitionally the unconditioned. The idea there would be that any entity which is unconditioned is omnipresent and omnitemporal, and whatever is omnipresent, omnitemporal, all-inclusive is unconditioned, is nirvana, is the end of suffering. So by taking any particular or any limited universal and making it actually unconditional, it itself becomes the end of suffering. This is because desire is for some determinate thing and hence both requires conditionality and is also necessarily foiled by it. So the Tiantai picture goes on to expand, if we had in Madhyamaka, as I mentioned a moment ago, an ultimate truth that's purely apophatic, that would be emptiness, non-conceptual, probably meant to be experiential, and then conventional truth or provisional truth, which is all possible, or some subset of all possible determinate claims. We have this extended through this mechanism in Tiantai, excuse me, simply by pushing it further. So if we say that no X is definitively X, that is, it is empty of self-nature, it is not independently or unconditionally X, it is determinate only by being negated and by being dependent on conditions that are external to itself. All of them are abstractions, false universals, etc. But since X is not definitively X, non-X, that is the exclusion of X, is not definitively the exclusion of X. X and the exclusion of X are both equally X and the exclusion of X, and in the same sense, as necessary but false universal generalizations, as provisional determinations, and because equally present in their negation, as omnipresent and unconditional, therefore as nirvanic, as salvific, as the end of suffering. So there we have that intersubsumptive structure. Each is findable only when looked for, but once looked for, findable whenever, anywhere. This is a condition I call ontological ambiguity, and we'll have more illustrations of that in a second. So not the two truths, conventionally determinate and ultimately indeterminate, but three: emptiness, provisional positing, and the middle, or the intersubsumption of the two. Nirvana, or the unconditioned, cannot be indeterminate simpliciter, which would be conditioned by the exclusion of the conditional. So this is something like the true infinite idea in Hegel, right? A purely unconditioned, ironically, turns out to be a way of conditioning something. Indeterminate is a determination. Indetermination fully realized, brought to the extreme of exceptionlessness, reverses into determination. It's a point that goes back quite early in Chinese Buddhism to Songzhao, for those of you students of Chinese Buddhism. Determination fully realized, on the other hand, brought to the extreme of exceptionlessness, reverses into indetermination, that is to say, ambiguity, which is both determinate and indeterminate at once. Not a blank, not a definite thing, but precisely quad-definite, indefinite, and vice versa. And that's the middle. This is easiest, so let's just say, let's skip to the last one there. Determinacy and indeterminacy intersubsume in ambiguity. Every determinacy also being also intrinsically indeterminate, hence unable to exclude any other determinacy. All determinacies also intersubsume with all other determinacies. I'll say more about that in a second, but it's not merely determinacy per se or indeterminacy per se that we're talking about here. That entails every possible determinacy intersubsuming with every other determinacy with each other. I think for time's sake, I'm going to skip the kind of work through of how determinacy reverses into indeterminacy and vice versa, okay? And how any specific determinacy reverses into indeterminacy, although on that one I will pause. Here, just for this part, right, that may have been confusing. So why every other one? Knowing the ambiguity of the present experience, precisely because so closely interlocked with every extraneous determinacy, also means knowing that there will always be opportunities for seeing it otherwise appear, as it has no single determinate cosmos to serve as disambiguating context. Briefly, the thought I skipped over there is, A, determinate and indeterminate are mutually determining. That sort of follows. It's sort of a no-brainer, although it's weird to think about. But further, every time you have a particular thing determined provisionally, you presuppose a context consistent with it, which supports that particular reading of that ambiguous thing, disambiguating it, as we will see. But that leads to a kind of an infinite regress where you would require a totality that supports a determinate totality that would to support a determinate particular. And a determinate totality is just as impossible as a self-standing determinate particular, because self-standingness can never be determinate. That's the idea. So if the all can have no particular character because there's nothing outside of it to characterize it, to contrast to it, that is. So seeing the possibility of seeing this one experience otherwise is already an instance of seeing it otherwise, seeing that in principle its determinacy as X does not preclude its non-determinacy as X. And the second point is the one I just want to bring to your attention. Because this ambiguity applies to any and every determinacy without exception, determinacy as such, it is illimitable. It means the possibility of seeing this one determinacy in any other possible way. For if any determination X could be definitely excluded from what is now appearing as this cup, this would amount to regarding this cup at least not being X, an elephant, for example, as fully determinate and unambiguous. And if we've excluded the possibility of something being fully determinate and unambiguous to the exclusion of its ambiguity, then we cannot admit that either. And that is where we get this intersubsumption of all particulars. And seeing this one experience otherwise, in turn, entails changing the way all other interlocked determinacies are seen. They must now be seen as consistent with its being determinate in this precise way. The particular thing there then serves as the universal determinant. Okay, so that's a lot of abstract language, and I wanted to take advantage of the PowerPoint to use some illustrations of this that I often rely on. So when we talk about ontological ambiguity, you might ask it like this, right? What is this figure? Without a context, you had a prior context implicitly that maybe you read it as a circle or an O or a zero. If I gave you just this figure, I would disambiguate that. If I gave you this alternate context to it, I would disambiguate in a different way. It's a zero, it's an O, right? If I give you both at once, it's a zero, it's an O at once. That's sort of what I basically mean when I talk about the ontological ambiguity of the thing. And its illimitability, because as I've given context, I have also required context for those contexts, since their determination is what is necessary to disambiguate this one. But also, I can say now, just by adding these things way over here, that this, I'm pointing with my cursor, is a triangle. This is a triangle. It's the vertex of a triangle. I'm pointing to a part of a thing, right? And we can keep expanding that. When I talk about things having to be consistent with a totality that by disambiguating one, I've disambiguated the rest, I have in mind something like this. I don't know if this illustration will be helpful, but this is one of those figures that you can either see this corner as in front and this corner in back, or if you squint a little, you can see this one in front and this one in back, right? And as soon as I change one point, how I'm seeing one point, all the other points instantly change with it, right? As soon as this comes forward, this one shoots back, and this becomes a back wall rather than a top one, etc. You get the idea. And I would like to look at this famous Wittgenstein duck rabbit idea in a similar way, right? You have a totality like you have here, where all the points cohere in a particular way, to give you these two opposed figures, not this foreground background one, but very different qualities of duck and rabbit, and they have to be taken in as totalities. But I also want to claim that it requires you to see that consistency of one figure, total duckishness, let's say, is required to, let's say, foment the crisis of seeing that totality now also in the opposite way. In other words, as long as I'm just seeing, well, I think that looks like a rabbit eye, in which case, wait, what would that be? What's that thing there? I'm still totally in rabbit world. But once I've seen the entire figure as rabbit, with nothing more now to hold it in place, I can see the entire figure flip into duck. So this is kind of the on that model of the universalization with no further thing to confirm it, to contrast to it and be consistent with it, as hold it in place, if you like, as the condition for its original determinacy as duck, let's say, bottoming out, emptying itself into rabbit. And I would read the duck rabbit there not as just an adventitious thing, like, well, this one just like that O happens to be a particularly ambiguous figure, but as a global characteristic. So the alternate readability is built into what it is to be a rabbit. That's why I say as a Mobius strip of duck and rabbit, where there's always two sides, right? They're always opposed, but if you just follow through on any one side, it ends up being the other side. To do that, I maybe want to replace the duck rabbit with a more universal example, like the chocolate bunny, but that would require us to think of it this way. You have to imagine a world where there are no other bunnies that are not made of chocolate, and there is no other chocolate that is not in the shape of a bunny, right? So all bunnies are also chocolate, and all chocolate is also bunny. This is a little closer to, I want to sort of do a on-the-ground intervention on sort of the Aristotelian form-matter relationship here, where instead of having a sort of fixed one-way hierarchy between the two, I would have simply the switchability between those two, the inevitable switchability, where the full realization of one leads into the other as the very nature of what it is to be a rabbit or to be chocolate, since there are no others, and all chocolate has this characteristic. So if I need some chocolate to eat, I have it in the form of bunny. And if I need for my a bunny for my tortoise and hare diorama, let's say, I have it in the form of chocolate. That is to say, there's not one that's always form and one that's always the matter. It depends on my interest or desire. All the bunny is chocolate, all the chocolate is bunny. Form and matter distinction not fixed a la Aristotle, but merely a way of marking the always available ability to switch between these two opposite ways of regarding and using the whole. This distinction is merely a way of denoting of the chocolate, it can always be a bunny, and a way of denoting of the bunny, it can always also be chocolate, and does so through being more fully bunny, and does so by being more fully chocolate. Triggers the flip is the full realization of either side, like the Mobius strip. A way of denoting chocolate and bunny are different, opposite, exclusive, determined only by their contrastive difference. So in this world, there is only bunny and chocolate. So when I say bunny, I mean the not chocolate aspect. And when I say chocolate, I mean the not bunny aspect. But are also entirely coextensive, alternate senses of the same referent. Same but different, different but same. Alternate senses of the same referent, but that referent intrinsically has these multiple senses. To be a referent involves the multiplicity, the switchability of senses. So in the end there, chocolate would mean chocolate bunny, and bunny would also mean chocolate bunny or bunny chocolate. In either case, what we are really referring to is the entire composite of both, plus their necessary difference, by which alone there are two to be composed, plus three, their inseparability, plus four, their the switchability between them. The two denotations or senses of this one referent are then not merely opposed, but are themselves synonyms for each other, and this is the only referent there is. This is kind of the Tiantai picture. Bunny is a word for both and is omnipresent in all four senses, and the same goes for duck. So we would have a Mobius strip. Again, there's a contrast everywhere. There are two sides. There is never the loss of the doubleness, but either side fully realized brings the other side. Seeing the I, that dot there as a duck eye, requires the totalization of duck context. And only then can the entire duck intersubsume with rabbit. One way to look at this is to think of, sort of from the history of philosophy, Thales, right? Claims all is water. When you have a totalizing claim like that, there's a meaning change that takes place. Water initially meant the fluid element as opposed to the fiery, solid, and airy ones. And what it meant was only obtained by contrasting or excluding these things. But when the all claim is given, this entails that meaning changes. Now, water means what sometimes appears fluid, but also sometimes appears fiery, solid, or airy. Its primary appearance as fluid quickly becomes elusive and irrelevant. It now means what can appear as anything under the right conditions. So interestingly, we might say a claim like all ice is made of water is false, for maybe you would say, because dry ice is made of CO2, not H2O, because it can be false because water still has a definite referent, that is H2O. And yet, the claim all things are made of water, not just all ice, but all things, is true, but only because water no longer has anything contrasted to it. The claim already includes the hypothesis that CO2, like all other things, is another form of water. Water becomes an empty signifier. It is true only in the sense that it is interchangeable with any other signifier as a road to their interchangeability. So all this is to say how Tiantai deals with that universal problem by leaning into it, exacerbating it, pushing it to the extreme where it collapses into itself. That's the basic picture I wanted to give you. And then I am going to read this. This is a quote from a Tiantai writer. And I'm going to read it chunk by chunk so we see how this picture, on the basis of this way of dealing with the problem, will bring us to somewhat different results. And I don't have that much more to go, don't worry. 30 slides. Okay. So the first line of that text, Tang Dynasty text from John Ron, says this: beginninglessly there has been nothing to you or any sentient being but afflictive delusions, self-defeating volitions, that is karmic action, and suffering, nothing besides. You are thoroughly delusion, contingency, self-defeating action. But all of this is precisely the threefold Buddha nature, precisely the inextricable and omnipresent. And the threefold Buddha nature is another name for the three truths that we were just talking about, that relation of intersubsumption. John Rutt here is saying that if this is interesting, but we probably don't have time for it, but the three aspects of deluded everyday existence have that same relation, where afflictive delusions, that's on the cognitive side, karma on the action side, and suffering, actually the intersubsumption of those two, are precisely the three truths in that intersubsumptive relationship. And it's no other than that thing which is now going to be, the very same referent is now what is going to be called Buddhahood after this process that he's going to describe. Next step. When you have not yet aspired to realize it or take up realize this fact that your entire being of delusion is entirely Buddhahood, that is to say, unconditioned, precisely in being conditioned, infinite in being finite, etc., or taking up any practices conducive to doing so, these inextricable practical and cognitive causes of that realization are together called merely the inextricable nature of all things as such. That means even though your cognitions and your actions are all actually compose that object to be realized as the absolute, when it has not been yet thought through to be realized in that way, in other words, as mutually intersubsumptive, we just say there is this nature that exists in things. And so the next line there after the bracket, this is why we merely say all sentient beings have the inextricable Buddha nature per se, as if it were some objective fact like that exists within you. You know, the kingdom of heaven is within you, or you have a soul within you above and beyond or beneath your delusions and stupid activities. Okay? So that is a redescription where all that stuff is folded in, right? And then we get a progressive unfolding of that. Once it is the next step from John Ron's text, I don't know if I need to, I think I basically said that, but I'll read that. In fact, one's own deluded activity already is the activity of Buddhahood, but at first this can only be described as having the nature of Buddhahood hidden within it as the three truths. There are some truths beyond the surface in that claim, provisionally asserted, as yet to be discovered. Buddhahood actually includes the cognition of it, but one so far does not have cognition of it, and thus regards one's cognitions as other than its cognition. And yet, as such, the cognition of it has and has not already occurred. The intersubsuming ambiguity between karma, deluded action, and affliction, deluded cognition, as two sides of the Mobius strip, will turn out always to have been the cognition and action of Buddhahood, and the Buddha's cognition of an action in the world. I won't go into set up punchline about that. The text goes on to say, okay, so first you're entirely it. We call that you simply having it. And once you've accepted that one's own mind possesses this inextricable nature, we then show that this nature itself has no insides or outsides, as we just talked about, right? In positing an outside contrastive to itself, it intersubsumes with that. So just like the two sides of the Mobius strip, it always has an outside, but it always intersubsumes that outside. The outside becomes internal, the internal becomes external. As such, John Ron says, it thus pervades all space, the same through all Buddhas, equally here through everything in the entire field of possible experience. So you remember I said, not self self is not really self, and in the same way, the exclusion of self is not really the exclusion of self, and yet both of those qualities are equally inextricable from both sides. All right. Once its omnipresent pervasion is accepted, we show that whatever it pervades is also inextricable from it at every locus. That is to say, it is possessed in you right now, as a damped down way of saying you are nothing but that. But it is not only possessed in you, but is possessed in all things because it has no inside and outside. But because it has no inside or outside, or because it is the intersubsuming of inside and outside, wherever it is possessed, it also possesses. And so it possesses whatever it is relating to as an outside to it. And that means since it is in everything, all those things it possesses anywhere are possessed everywhere. That's the kind of logic here. Since it is the same through all Buddhas and equally there through everything in the entire field of possible experience, the bodies of all Buddhas are inextricably present at every locus in this omnipresently pervasive nature, such that one body being given, all beings are aspects of this body, and he goes on from there. It is there to be discovered inside. Then, that's the first step, then the kind of it this is can be located in no one place, being ambiguously present and absent at every locus. So if it's here, it's equally everywhere else. And then, for the same reason, it can't merely be in every locus. Every locus must also be in it, or not just locus, being an object, an act of cognition. Then, every locus and being an object of cognition is in and out of every other locus and being an object of cognition. That's intersubsumption, full stop. For any this as opposed to other, any determination, what it is to be this turns out to be what it is to be other without annulling the distinction between the two, but rather making that distinction, and thus both opposed entities, internal to each of the two. For what it is to be this / other, which is also what it is to be other, that is, other / this. Back to Hegel. I reversed the terms there. Is this distinction between this other and other this? In other words, rabbit front, duck back, duck front, rabbit back, right? I'm using the chocolate as a bunny, I'm using the bunny as chocolate. That change in the relation between the two, although both are always present and always reversible, is that kind of thing maybe a generous reading? We could say what we see in the distinction between God revealing his own infinity in Hegel and man worshiping his own finitude slash infinity. So infinity slash finitude versus finitude slash infinity as a way of speaking, sort of restoring the intersubsumption to the two functions of revealing on the one hand and worshiping on the other hand. Why not, as I asked before, God revealing and worshiping and man worshiping and revealing? In other words, bring those two qualities to the next step. You can still keep reversing them, but you will have both on both sides, right? There's no reason why that should stop just at the level of those two opposed functions, which seem to be given a definite identity, definite role, definite purpose. Okay. Now, we could argue, if I really want to give a charitable reading, that this is what we see in at least Hegel's reading of the Trinity and the related, though different, doctrine of the Incarnation. Christ reveals and worships God. That's biblical, right? And the Christian worships and reveals God, which is to say, manifests God to the world. I don't know if that counts as manifesting it to God, but maybe you could make that case. I think Hegel does. But does Christ also reveal and worship man? Does man reveal and worship man? Maybe. But each man, maybe. But each part of each man, there I think we clearly have no for an answer, even in the most charitable reading. The unreconstructed specialness of Christ, even Christ the man and the qua man, and the unwaveringly hierarchy of specific values so embodied. The definition of holiness inherited from theism, in other words, gets in the way. It's my view. But that is what would be needed to complete full intersubsumption. Theism creeps in to introduce an exception, and I think this is evident not only in the inadequate form of religion, as the young Hegelians would claim, so they would say against that passage by Strauss, well, yeah, that's true in the inadequate form of religious consciousness, but in philosophy we overcome that disparity between the two sides of God and man. They do fully intersubsume. There is no infinity beyond being for self of man per se, conscious human or otherwise, which is always also finite. But I think even if you were to admit that, it is still that inheritance is still evident in the very structure of absolute knowledge, the structure of the final philosophical system, not just the religious system. And in the handout that I sent around, I go into this in some detail, but it really boils down for me to a couple of factors. That we're going to have a finite number of categories in that final system, albeit a really impressively granular, detailed one where Hegel works out for every, a pretty good web of all possible determinations. But of course, contingencies continue to break through. And I think Hegel has a picture where those are kind of quickly absorbed into necessity, as I was saying about Napoleon above, and I could go into the Beatles Stones version of that. So however finely grained it is, what you do not get is the necessity of the contingency of the very specific structure of a particular moment of human experience, like, right now the configuration of objects in this room functioning as a category. Of course you wouldn't for Hegel. It exists, it is rational, it is necessary, yes. But insofar as it sort of is absorbed very finely into those categories that exist. That's one thing where I see this sort of limiting structure to full intersubsumption. And the other one is in the definite single order of the relations. For example, the order of the derivation of the categories in the logic, and through the rest of the system, one after another in only that order and no other order. And that's related to the thing I mentioned earlier, the relation of necessity and contingency, or of purpose and purposelessness, as not intersubsumptive. Yes, contingency is given a place, but it is unidirectionally subsumed. What I like to do as a thought experiment is the kind of thinking through of what would require to sort of Tiantai-ify the Hegelian system, it would not mean the absence or the unimportance of the final category of philosophy. It is necessary, just as in Buddhism, the Buddhist kind of picture, that moment of Buddhist practice is, of course, necessary, and it underpins the way the system is described. But the question is, upon reaching that, it should change the understanding of every other category such that thereafter each can equally serve as the culminating final point that subsumes and realizes all the others, as philosophy did. This is Kai Quan Xianshi in the Tiantai system. I'm happy to talk about that in more sort of Buddhological terms in Q&A. But this would mean henceforth experiencing art, religion, civil society, law, science, all these things that get proper treatment along the way, but also sensation, perception, unhappy consciousness, but even loafing, daydreaming, confusion, killing time, behaving absurdly, each one of them alone as the telos of all things, the substance of all things, the subject of all things, which bear into themselves a particular way of integrating all other categories. This would mean reading Hegel's system not only forwards but backwards, and indeed in infinite alternate sequences, starting anywhere, moving from there to everywhere else through any sequence of necessary self-sublations. I say they're still necessary because moving from any one point to another point, you will have a necessary self-undermining explosion into a different determination, as we've been talking about, right? The Mobius strip overturning of the full thinking through of any determinacy at all. So that the full realization of all reality, the true substance and subject of all, is indeed whatever determination, contingency, determinate contingency may be present at any moment. I'm kind of at time, but if I have 2 minutes, I'll just read through the full Tiantai picture where I think this is the case. Every moment of experience is a contingent and purposeless event. That's that original state of being nothing but delusion and irrational, self-defeating will and action that we got from Janran quote in the first line. Every moment of experience is that, but also a new but retroactively eternal category, which is an unconditioned thing, end of suffering, that applies everywhere. A category meaning something empirically undiscoverable, yet necessarily discoverable everywhere, necessarily both absent simpliciter and omnipresently operative in the manner of a Kantian transcendental category, like causality, for example. But not subjective merely, rather neither inside nor outside, these being two more such transcendental categories. Absent and omnipresent to both the subjective and objective locus. So both absent and omnipresent, both here and anywhere else. The subjective a priori apparatus is itself both absent and omnipresent at every locus, neither an indisputable, unavoidable fact, nor an optional avoidable projection. The finite purpose embedded in its constitutive desire is both groundless, futile, and self-doomed, and a subsequently ineradicable and eternal purpose of all existence. So every content is a category, every category is a content. Buddhahood, generated immanently by negation, really of negation, of negation, of negation. This is in the handout, a passage from Jury that I'm particularly fond of. Intrinsic to determinacy or suffering or finitude or conditionality per se. That generative relationship between divine and human, fully reversible, reciprocal, intersubsumptive, spirit no more primary and generative than matter, infinity no more primary and generative than finitude, anyone's good no more so than anyone's definition of evil. Each is negated by being universalized, universalized by being negated. The specific practice of mind contemplation is analogous to the threefold structure of, this is a trope that I would maybe be useful, the threefold structure of hyperrealistic artistic framing. The content becomes more itself when let's say in a Flaubert novel, a realistic novel that is extremely precise. The content becomes more itself, less itself, framed as fictional. That's jia, provisional positing. That's the more itself. Kong, empty, less itself, framed as fictional. And intersubsumptive, the middle, the absolute of all other contents. It now becomes a style applicable to illimitable contents. As looking up from a Flaubert novel, you may find the world Flauberticized, if I could put it that way. Framing lifts it from its single context, at once solidifying into standalone moment and desolidifying, connecting to infinite contexts. So we end up with infinite alternate sequences of subsumption and intersubsumption, always reversible into intersubsumption. And this is where the religious significance, the soteriological implication resides. Thinking of Buddha is implicit in the relationship to otherness, intrinsic to thinking of oneself or any other definite being. And it is this presence of the thought of Buddhahood in any moment, which is the Buddha thinking of oneself, seeing oneself already as a Buddha, whose every cognition and action is an expression of Buddhahood, intersubsuming with all other cognitions and actions. And that is where I will stop. Not too bad, right? We started at about 10 after.
Yeah, very good. Okay, thank you so much, Brooke, for this very stimulating and exciting talk. Let's open up for questions, but let's go ahead and just a couple words about the format here. So if you have a question, I would prefer if you just use the react button like this. And if you're on YouTube, you can put your question in the comment and then I will read it for you. Or you can also turn on your screen and just raise your hand physically. Let us know you have a question. Or you can send me a message in the chat, do some subsuming, and we'll get started. Okay, so who'd like to ask the first question? Let's look on YouTube as well and see if we have anything going on. I got lots of questions, but I don't want to ask the first one. Okay, Alex, you raised the first question. Good. Okay, go for it.
Yes, I break the ice. Well, thank you. This was really interesting, and I know almost nothing about Buddhist philosophy, so I will. I apologize if my question is more of a clarification question, but what I find most fascinating about your comparison between Tiantai Buddhism and Hegel's philosophy is that usually I read Hegel the other way around. So, namely, if I understand your criticism of Hegel and your reading of Hegel is Hegel tries to get to a complete intersubsumption of categories, but it doesn't manage and doesn't get to the point of realizing a complete intersubsumption between these categories. So there are, so to say, there is a residue. There are some categories that, in a way, escape this complete intersubsumption, such as purpose and teleology, etc., etc. Whereas I usually, so to say, read it the other way around, namely, so to say, I usually understand, if I get it correctly, intersubsumption as the critical phase of Hegel's logic. Namely, I want to set a difference, but I don't manage. So
Right.
this fails.
Yes.
And so in order to set the difference, I must do something else, so to say. And that's, I mean, this is a whole new perspective on Hegel, and I'm really fascinated by it. And that's why I wanted to. Sorry, I see you have difficulties in listening to me. Maybe let me try something.
No, I'm okay.
Can you hear better?
I can hear. Yeah. A few words drop, but I think I get your point. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, thank you. And so I was wondering, there is a word that you either never or almost never mentioned in your talk, but that goes throughout your paper, which is maybe an interesting way of addressing the problem I'm talking about, which is sublation.
Yeah.
So, what is the relationship between sublation and intersubsumption, so to say?
Great. Yeah. Okay. To your first point, I think this is an incredibly useful way to put it. Yeah, I agree. That's maybe a simpler way to put the point of the whole presentation is that, yeah, Hegel, I wouldn't claim that Hegel's goal is to reach full intersubsumption. I think he believes, and this is where we might more simply put the sort of well, the traditional inheritance that he is still guiding this work in spite of everything that's so innovative about it, right? Which is, yeah, ambiguity is bad, and intersubsumption is bad. We really want maximal articulation and to be able to have differences which will stand up, right? But unfortunately, everywhere we look, there's intersubsumption, and even our most basic categories of identity and difference, right, and subject and substance get us in trouble. But fear not, fear not. I have a way, even though we can fully address those, to still end up where we've always wanted to end up, which is with things having distinct and definite identities, right? So, in terms of the book, I really dealing with it, in terms of the tradition deriving from, really, I think, from Anaxagoras, as quoted by Socrates in the Phaedo, of nous as arche, right? Where actually determinateness and sort of the fear or the suppression or the terror of apeiron, right? Of the boundless, the indeterminate, is really the defining impetus of much of the tradition. And Hegel's interesting because, he reaches a point where he sees just how difficult that is and how many, hurdles one has to jump to finally get to what we've all wanted all along. But so I don't need to claim, and I don't mean to claim that Hegel's intending that, but what I want to say is, I think his prejudice of wanting that goal is dependent upon those inheritances, and particularly, probably, it would be fair to say, a broadly soteriological view, which is to say it's better, or pragmatic view, if you want to put it more simply, right? That it's better for things to have fixed identities and not to be ambiguous, right? So, but in the meantime, he's developed this incredibly powerful engine of critique. And the question now becomes, can he legitimately, after showing, identity and difference is a good enough example, right? Once you're there toward the beginning of part 2 of the logic, and the non-stability of those two concepts is firmly in hand, right? Do you have to follow from there everything he does to try to fix it through all these trips and tumbles that we get until finally we arrive at this very questionable final piece that depends on keeping all those pieces in place, which I agree is probably his own personal desideratum. So another way to put the project here is to say, look, if you come at this from the atheist side, so I call that whole determinacy is what life is all about thing, the theistic picture, okay? Where ultimately, metaphysically and ethically, the sort of sorting of things into definite, unambiguous categories, especially good and evil ones, is the name of the game. The Buddhist picture is an atheist picture, and its starting point is exactly the opposite, right? That's the problem. It is desire rooted in and exacerbating the actually insupportable dichotomizations of things into stable this and that, right? And so I think there's a different soteriological or pragmatic goal or way of understanding the nature of sort of human condition type of problem here, right? And so the comparison, I guess I am having to argue on his own terms, Hegel should have abandoned his pragmatic inherited soteriological orientation against formlessness, indetermination, ambiguity, and just embraced it. And there are actually some readings, as you kind of alluded to, there are some readings of Hegel that sort of, it's sort of a variant of what I'm talking about here. They will say the way of overcoming ambiguity is to embrace it. So it's still, the goal is to overcome it, right? And that's where things get really messy, right, or really tricky. So are you going to, and that's why at the end, I just want to say, yeah, I would buy that too, except then the system shouldn't look the way it looks, right? And so the final is proof is in the pudding, kind of.
Alex, very briefly.
May I just weigh
Yeah.
just a further comment? Thank you. This is very clarifying. Another way of putting it, maybe instead of determination, ambiguity, is also symmetry, asymmetry. So
Yeah.
I'm under the impression that, so to say, intersubsumption is a symmetrical
Yes.
device, whereas sublation is an asymmetrical device. And I will definitely read your book because basically I have an atheist reading of Hegel, but I have a very asymmetrical reading of Hegel. So
Oh,
maybe the question is whether it is possible to read Hegel as an atheist, but
yeah.
as an asymmetrical philosopher.
Sure.
So
Sure.
this is very
Well,
exciting.
you
Thank you.
know, Alex, I mean, this is why the allusion to the young Hegelians, I think, are trying to do that, right? So they maintain the asymmetry of the system of the dialectic, right? Of sublation in that sense, it works only in one direction, right? So really, yeah, you're right. It is a, so you could say intersublation. I use that term once or twice in here, right? That is what I'm looking for, with everything implied by sublation, right? As the fuller realization of a side spilling over, turning over into the other side. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Thank
This is
you.
already very nice, very interesting conversation. Ed, please, the floor is yours for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Brook, for a very interesting paper. I want to just pick up on your response to Alessandro and where you ended. It seems to me you've characterized very well the way that Hegel distinguishes between the Western consciousness and the Eastern consciousness, and that your desire to push Hegel into some sort of intersubsumption mode instead of the hierarchical mode that he really embraces is a perfect distinction between this Western and Eastern. And what I'm wondering about is why you want to push him in the direction of the Eastern mode. And in particular, what Hegel has that you don't find in the Buddhist accounts, as you really make clear, is this notion of normativity and directionality.
Yes.
There's a Western project, and it's been undertaken, and it has been accomplished. Contradictions emerge, but those contradictions are overcome at a higher level. And that overcoming and the higher level is very positive. And we keep going until we get to some sort of completion that I don't think really dims the prospect for further development and a further, still higher completion. But it's just the opposite with the kind of subsumption mode that you laid out so well. You could have the end at any point. There's no development. There's no prospect for a directionality. There's no normativity. There's no completion, or unless you talk about the completion you have at every moment.
Okay.
You've really undermined the Western project here. And what I find interesting is your willingness to do that. And what I would like you to ask you about is why.
Yes. Okay, great. So yeah, and I alluded briefly, to occasional places in Hegel where he will say weird things like the absolute purpose is accomplishing itself at every moment, and it's only our illusion that keeps us from seeing that. But that illusion is the way in which it accomplishes itself, and that kind of, which would argue to the idea that it's intrinsic already in Hegel, and and I know that particular line in Hegel is often raised as, see, this is what's wrong with Hegel. It's this quietism that actually undermines the kind of agency of what you call the Western project. So yes, I do think so, and I am objecting to that project, but maybe not in so stark terms as you're suggesting. I do think the idea of a single, that's largely what my book is about. What are the costs of a belief in a single direction, a single purposivity, to the exclusion of any other purposivity? So what I really want, so two ways to answer your question. One is, of course, for the sake of argument, I do, in thinking about sort of Buddhist philosophies like the Tiantai system, there is a worked out set of premises about the origin of suffering that has to do with desire and the singularity of a particular object of desire. So there's a critique of teleological action built in, and Taoism too, right? You have the idea of Wu Wei, and there's a critique of a certain way of understanding purposivity there. However, as I try maybe ad nauseum in the book to clarify, the problem here is not purposive action. And this is true as you move into further refinements in both Taoist and Buddhist thoughts, right? They begin with an insight about the non-ultimacy of purpose, which is to say, when it is imported into an ontological primary category and an ethically ultimate category. So, that's why I call it theism or monotheism, because monotheism for me means the world is based on a purpose, metaphysically, right? There was if you dig down all the way to the constitution of beings, there is a purpose, a single purpose behind each and every one of them, right? And for world history, the same way, there's a single purpose. So what I would like to argue, and I think this is in line with both, not primitive Buddhism and not primitive Taoism, but more the developments, dialectical developments on that basis through kind of negations of negations, right? By thoroughly negating purpose, by locating purposelessness and absolute contingency at the root of things, we do not eliminate purposes. I try to argue in the book that there's a kind of asymmetry between purpose and purposelessness, where purposelessness by its nature will exclude, to whatever degree possible, purposelessness, but purposelessness will not exclude purposes, plural. So in fact would enable them, and I would argue even energize them, but it sets up a different kind of relation between alternate purposes. So it's not that there's no directionality. There are directionalities that are imminently created by contingencies, just as I'm not saying there's no universality. I'm saying that universalities are unavoidable, but they relate to alternate universalities and alternate directions in ways that do not have to be mutually exclusive. And I guess, but at the back of this is an idea that there is something undesirable about the exclusion of most purposes by the one big purpose, or its sort of grudging integration into it, and a kind of violence to experience that is of particular interest to me. So, yeah, go ahead.
Can't you include them? Isn't it? It's not an exclusion. It's you said grudging, but it's not grudging. It's encompassing.
I think it is right. It's grudging. I do think it's grudging. I think it's limited, and that's what I was trying to say about Hegel's system. He does an awesome job of building in as many sort of individual passions and happenstance circumstances into all of that, but it all gets absorbed unilaterally. That's one thing in this one particular way, and many things are still excluded from it. So I mean, just the details of experience at a very, it's a sort of training in neglecting certain aspects of experience that do not fit them. That's why I have extremely high regard for what Hegel has done in getting us as many categories as he does. He does include them. You're right, it's not grudging in that, it is supposed to be kind of the virtuosity of the system to give you as many, that it manifests and develops itself in so many ways. But compared to the sort of thickness of momentary, moment by moment experience, so much is left out. Not to mention, yes, it is about, whether you think having an absolute norm of good and bad is a good thing.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't, though. So, but that's
Okay.
complicated. Yeah.
I see. Very, very interesting conversation. So I'm going to kind of try to push us to go to the next question because try to get as many in as we can. Okay, Tiani, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you for your talk. It's really fascinating. I just have a question about, don't you also think that there is some sort of asymmetry within the Tiantai system itself? Because, for example, in the Zhanren passage you quoted, like it is only with the final realization that you can retrospectively see previous things in
Yes.
this light. And also, like for example, like 开权显实, 开记显本, right? It is only with the final teaching of the
Yes.
Lotus and the Nirvana Sutra do we see like early teachings as non-different or with this final truth. But isn't like the Hegelian system work in a similar way? It like at the end of the logic, like for example, we can also like view previous thought determinations from the perspective of the absolute idea, right? So, but I guess another related question is, but the Tiantai Buddhists, they also insist on like something like 废记立本, right? It's like they wouldn't recommend people like after like the Lotus Sutra and the Nirvana Sutra, they wouldn't recommend people to practice like let's say Hinayana teachings, at least not without like having the Tiantai interpretation of previous teaching
Yes.
inside. So yeah, I just
Yes.
wonder like if you
Yes, very good question. And this is exactly what I was trying to get at when I said, the Tiantaification of the Hegel system would not require eliminating the initial teleological or hierarchical or directional structure, asymmetrical structure. Every structure is initially asymmetrical, right? Which is to say that, and it's just what I was just trying to say to Edward, is that there's always going to be a direction, a purpose, a structure, and even a universalization. So in the Tiantai case, right, you have an idea of Buddhist practice, and you have the progressive sort of revelation of sutras up to the Lotus and Nirvana. But the difference is, yes, in a certain sense, in Hegel's picture, I can go back once I reach the final category, and now I'm going to experience art and philosophy differently. But the difference is, in Tiantai, I'm not only going to experience Hinayana differently, I'm going to experience Hinayana as the Lotus Sutra. So it is the ultimate teaching. Once I do have to first reach there, but it's kind of a self-nullifying direction that opens up this infinity of other asymmetries. Right? Not just that one. So, there's a line. Yes, they would recommend you can go back to practice Hinayana, right? This is this famous, I mean, we don't have to get into the weeds of this, but there's a line in the Lotus Sutra, right? Is 开觉生闻法, 为诸经之王, which means in the Sanskrit probably what you're implying, which is it gives the proper place to the Hinayana teaching, and the Lotus Sutra, is the king of all sutras. But in Tiantai, they don't read it that way due to some ambiguities of Chinese grammar, right? They read the subject all the way through as Sheng Wen Fa, the Hinayana teaching, is Zhu Jing Zhi Wang, is the king of all sutras. But indeed, only after one has reached that point. So there's no way to eliminate that asymmetry initially, or, that there is that final point. And I agree also that it does entail a rethink of the previous categories as seeming to imply it imperfectly in Hegel's case. But what you don't get is that from that point on, you are now reading every Hinayana Sutra and realizing every line of that is three truths. And then
Oh,
you
I
can
see.
forget about the Lotus Sutra. It's already all right here, right? You don't have to like contextualize it to the Lotus Sutra. You now see this thing differently. That's how I understand it.
Thanks.
I saw, uh, yeah, okay. So Ben, I guess, because there was actually Thaddy has his hand, but then Ben.
Yeah, yeah, that's listen. That's listen. That's listen.
The volume is no good.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better now. It's better now.
Okay, great. I'm on two computers here. So I think my question, I'll try to formulate it quickly, follows very directly on the last two, which is precisely, as you know, and thanks so much, Brooke, for being here, first of all. And as you know, I'm also very interested in this question of practice. And is it Tianyi's question, and also Ed's question about sort of teleology, but then specifically Tianyi's question also leads to, yeah, that really stood out to me in part two, the question that it's only after the practice that you understand the intersubsumption. And doesn't that maybe introduce a sort of directionality or asymmetry? Like you said, there's always directionality or asymmetry. But doesn't that not only have in Buddhism, and I would say in Taoism too, which I'm wrestling with if there's a difference, but not just any asymmetry, right? If it was any asymmetry, that maybe would be fine to the intersubsumption. Like the frog is experienced as different from the toads, and that's an asymmetry in their experience. I mean, I'm just as a random example, and that's fine because that's just one asymmetry among an infinite number of possible and actual asymmetries and multiple cosmoses and so on. But there seems to be a specific asymmetry here in the practice of Chinese Buddhism and maybe also Taoism, namely the asymmetry of having to come to enlightenment, right? Of this, it has to click for you. You have to get to that point, which in a way is actually quite Hegelian in the sense that spirit only realizes itself in humanity thinking, or in Hegel thinking spirit. It's not. I mean, it's different in that Hegel's conclusion isn't fully intersubsumptive, but the similarity is that to really practice, there's a certain kind. It's not just any practice in a way that gets you there. It's only practice that gets you to the irony, if you will, to the full irony, to the full intersubsumption.
Yes. So okay. I think we have here something that we've talked about many times, the structure that we see going through all these kind of things in Buddhism, the raft, right? It's a specific raft, right? You need a raft, you need to cling to the raft, and the raft will get you beyond rafts, right? And that's what makes it a raft, makes it a good raft, that you can renounce it. Not everything works as a raft, though. Not every non-raft gets you beyond the raft, right? And you may be floating on there's all kinds of different rafts. So there's no question that they think some way or another you've got it. And I mean, I will say though, even, and this is true actually in both cases. In Tiantai, of course, these are massive encyclopedic works. So how you realize the three truths, there's a billion different, ways to do that. But it is still a restricted field, granted, right? So, and that specific one thing, right, is, it's perfectly fine. It goes back to that question about normativity. I always feel this question is nagging because, wait, do I have to realize that all things are enlightened or can I just not, right? You don't have to. You don't have to do anything, There really isn't any one normativity, right? But if we're having this conversation and if you are, burdened by the non-enlightenment of all things, there are several ways to see that differently. But even us talking about it or you thinking about it would be the way in which that is practiced and realized asymmetrically, right? It's like, wait, no, that sort of makes sense, but what about this? No, that's the asymmetrical process, right? Now, there's no, if you don't do that, they will still say, well, you are enlightened whether you know it or not. So it's up to you whether you want to do anything. But don't forget, enlightened is not a norm in the sense of, an obligation. It's just about suffering, right? So if again, this is a consequence of the atheist framing, I would say, there really isn't any way to talk about an obligatory norm, but the idea is that, there's intrinsic suffering. Now, if you are able to numb yourself enough not to care, that's really your business, and that too will be enlightenment from the point of view of someone who sees it that way, right? You know what I mean? I mean, there's a kind of short circuit in that worry. It seems to me like there's a premise that there are specific solutions to specific problems. This particular one has this retroactive self-canceling nature, so that yes, if I do ride this raft to this point, I will then see, oh, all beings are on rafts and are already beyond rafts and are on all rafts, etc. Right? But there's no need for me to do that unless I'm motivated by my own suffering to do that. And B, one thing you will find in Tiantai text explicitly is the idea that, well, and we've talked about this, refraining from a practice is also asymmetrical and normative, right? In other words, if I say we see it in Chan, for example, right? And you get critiques of Chan from Tiantai along these lines, which is to say, just don't try to practice Buddhism and you'll be fine. You were always fine. Don't add anything to it. There's no escape from there being an asymmetry or a direction or a purpose. So it's just a question of upaically fitting them to specific cases, I think.
All right, maybe I'll take the opportunity to ask a question because I don't see on YouTube any questions. So, all right, okay, yes, I'll take the opportunity as moderator. Yeah, thanks so much, Brooke, for your really stimulating talk. And I feel there's a kindred spirit between your critique of Hegel and the one I'm trying to develop in this new book that I keep revising for the Edinburgh University Press. I'm a little overdue submitting this manuscript, but one of my critiques that I'm offering in this book is very similar to your critique of Hegel, but I'm focusing more on the concept non-conceptual distinction. Well, Hegel will talk about how the concept is the sole element of truth. And so it seems that there's a one-sidedness to the intersubsumption, right? Or, well, he'll put the non-conceptual under the concept, but we also need to see the concept under the non-conceptual.
Yes.
And this is a similar line of critique I see you developing, but it's a question of like what we're primarily concerned with, whereas you're focusing on the question of purpose, which is very important. Also in the whole Hegelian system, I'm focusing more on the question of the concept.
Yeah.
And the way that absolute knowledge, we privilege conceptual knowing in that pursuit. So I just wanted to say that I'm really sympathetic with the project and also with the concerns in reading Hegel. So I'm really excited to read the new book. Can I ask you where these critiques of Hegel, first, let me ask you the easy question, then I ask you the hard question, or what I think are harder questions. Because I still somehow am more bound to well, I won't call it theism, I'll call it panentheism. I'm probably more of a panentheist than not an atheist for sure. I'm wondering where these critiques of Hegel are in your writings that you presented here. Are they in the new book?
Well, yeah, I mean, this has been an issue that has exercised me for many years, and I've always wanted to this last thing, that's why I was excited to do this today, because you guys are, this thing is a perfect forum for this topic. I can assume a pretty good knowledge of Hegel and a certain open-mindedness to this kind of problem.
Yeah.
But, there are so many things um, that are that point, right? That intersubsumptive structure, right? Which, in a way, Hegel does better than anyone. I mean, he is so good at drawing it out in every possible, context. And so, for a lot of years, we do, with students here who have great interest in Hegel, um, we sort of informally try to do this Tiantai Hegel comparison and do sort of close reads of the logic with some of the Tiantai sources. But this is, I think, at least this is the most recent attempt to sort of pin down where I see what it is about Hegel that bothers me always, even though I'm like so enthralled by every move in the system in a way. So I wrote this piece that I sent you is from that book, as you were saying earlier. It's hard to keep these books down to size, and so this one ended up with a lot of the kind of digressive material like this
Yeah.
online. So it is in this book, but it's not. I mean, this is probably this and one of the other supplements, which sort of takes up pre-1807 Hegel and are the most explicit. I took out the specifically treating Hegel as one of the main sort of figures in this topic, and I offloaded them to these places. So
Okay.
so it's a lot of the vocabulary, as you notice in there, comes out of the things developed in the print version of the book, and all that kind of emulative, compensatory, blah blah blah, and the premises of the broad sense in which I use monotheism or theism. That's from the book, but the application specifically to this Tiantai versus Hegel. But this book isn't even mainly. I mean, Hegel and Tiantai are in the background basically on
Yeah.
every page, but they're not the explicit topics.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Let me go on to ask a question about the. So I think it's fair. I mean, Hegel himself, I think, is concerned with absolute knowledge. The absolute alone is true. And that, for this reason, I think, makes your critique and your concern legitimate. I mean, the absolute is relative to nothing, and therefore must itself be absolute and relative. It can't be relative to the relative. So the intersubsumption strategy, I think, and the critique, kind of addressing Hegel in those terms, is not illegitimate, and it somehow is born out of the concern for absolute knowing. So this is the first thing that I want to say, why I think like the question and the mode of critique is not just external. On the other hand, it almost seems as though when we take up the absolute, and we're actually taking up the intersubsumption as key to absolute knowing, we've already, in a way, it seemed acknowledged that the infinite has priority. What I mean is that the one-sidedness is a problem. And that's why we can look at Hegel and say, look, here's a problem. There's a one-sidedness. The one-sidedness is the failure. And Tiantai goes beyond that. Why? Because the infinite now is true to itself.
Yes.
And so my thought is this: Hegel is right to privilege the infinite over the finite. And the true infinite ought to be privileged over the finite. And that's what enables the critique to be successful. So what I'm going to make of that, I don't know. But my inclination is to say that the asymmetry is privileged in the critique of Hegel, and that's right. That's right. So I'm agreeing with the critique, but on the other hand, what I want to say is that that works for the privileging of the infinite over finitude in some way. So that's my first question. My second point is I'm wondering about I'm just curious what you think of that. My second question is about formal thinking and so-called concrete thinking, or like formal logic versus concrete. So Hegel has this idea that if you begin with pure indeterminacy, Unbestimmtheit, and then you have his dialectics of canceling and preserving, or Aufhebung, you're going to get contradictions, and then you're going to get particular results from the contradictions. So the idea, and we were talking about, why Hegel might want this, but the whole idea is that contradictions produce specific results. So right?
Yes.
Everything's finite, but then finitude is finite. But if finitude is finite, then finitude ceases to be, and then you have the non-finite. Okay, so you get these specific results from specific contradictions, right? So that's why I think, I mean, Hegel was to kind of think of a Hegelian rejoinder, that logic is just such that
Yes.
when
Yes.
you absolutize a category, like you said, you get the contradiction, just like you said. But then the dispute is what follows from that.
Yeah.
And Hegel said, oh, what you get is a specific result all the time.
Yes.
So you get the single order, you get finite categories, you get that directionality because from
Yeah.
contradictions, you get specific results. You don't just get
Yes.
something indeterminate every time.
Right.
So I wonder whether
Mm.
the question concerning, that you're raising, this concern about the order,
Mm.
also has concern about the logic and what to
Yeah.
do with contradictions. So
Yeah.
once because contradictions are inevitable, I think that they're true contradictions. So I think what you call ambiguity, I'm more inclined to speak of in terms of contradiction, but I'm wondering that part of the dispute has to do with what follows from the contradictions
Oh,
and
yes.
how do we determine that? And that may be a dispute about logic. So I could
Yes.
imagine a Hegelian saying this critique from the Tentai side is just an abstract,
Yeah.
formal logic that explodes the categories and it's just constantly exploding them. And so you don't get specificity anymore. So I
Yeah.
could imagine a kind of critique that Tentai is a one-sidedness that
Good.
loses specificity but it gains the symmetry of intersubsumption, but might lose specificity. So then one might worry, can I have
Yes. Can both.
specificity and the symmetry?
Okay.
I have other questions, but I'll leave it there for now. Maybe I'll just stop there. Oh yeah,
Great.
this is my just real brief thing.
Yeah.
I've heard people describe your view as trivialism,
Yeah.
that everything's true, and I would just like you to have a moment to speak to that.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Great.
Sorry for asking
So
so many questions.
no, that's like the perfect questions. This is really great. The first one about privileging the infinite, right? So, I mean, yes, I think you always get this. You could call it an equivocation in a way, right? But I think it's built in
Yeah.
and is necessary, right? Which is to say,
Exactly.
um, you know, you have to privilege, and again, this I would put to sort of Ben's question too, which is you have to privilege the infinite initially, right? That's the way of overcoming the one-sidedness of the finite, including the finitude of the abstract notion of infinity. But when that work is accomplished, the question is, does that what sense does it make now to talk about the infinite as opposed to the finite? The finite is as much the infinite as the infinite is the finite,
Exactly.
right? Now you could still say, okay, but there's the illusory finite and the illusory infinite that we had before we had worked it through, and there's a hierarchy, right? That's the directionality of the system. And that's why, in the slides I was saying, really it's built into the appearance reality split, or the complete truth, partial truth, or the
Yeah.
inexplicit, explicit, which are, as Tanny was saying, they're partially, there's a gesture toward a kind of intersubsumption there, but you can always up it to the next register and say, no, they have to be specific. And I have to agree, that's not to Hegel's mind, that's not that's not a bug, that's a feature, right? So I just think it should not. I don't think it's sustainable on his own premises. So that brings me to your second question, which is like, so this is more like a promissory note than something that has been accomplished. But what I'm gesturing toward here, what I really think, is that, there is a determinate result to every one of those sublations, right? That is the structure of the logic. I don't know if I want to say, I guess well, let me first say what a really hardcore Tiantai position would be, I think.
Yeah.
It would be, those deductions are valid but not obligatory, and that there's a certain amount of sophistry involved in their exclusionary nature, which is not to say they're arbitrary, right? But there are alternate ways, and in sort of the hardcore Tiantai view, they would say these are hayeically conditioned by the orientations of the particular sentient beings, their conceptual systems and their desires and so on. They are relative to some sentient being. So you would not have an absolute and that again is a theistic inheritance, that there just exists built into the nature of reality a structured, definite, kind of blueprint of logic. But what I want to preserve from that is the idea of a necessary deduction. But now we have to rethink that, because necessity. But I think Hegel gives us already the resources to do that, because he's told us more about what necessity means, right? And so in every one of those things, here's the promissory note. I was gesturing toward this at the end there, like. And I think this answers your other question about the specificity, because the specificity comes from contingency of individual sentient beings' experience with all their illimitable delusions. And why are there delusions? There are delusions precisely because there is no blueprint, there is no basis, there is a sort of infinite propensity for drift and noise. So any attempt, so you put it backwards, right? Any attempt to kind of enclose things always fails, right? Just because there will be a spillover, right? Now, that spillover we can regard as necessary, the fact of spilling over, right? The fact of transcending the determinate form that is imposed upon anything. But any particular way it does so is determinate, but only within a particular context. And Hegel knows that too, because it's the old to go to the left Hegelian type of thought, right? The future lasts forever, right? That's Althusser, right? That is to say, there's always going to be a future reconfiguration of what that was. So if I say category A leads to category B, once we've done all this work on what determination itself is, I can't just say it is category B that results full stop, simpliciter. I can say that in the same way that I said, well, this looked like A, but it turned out when I looked at it more closely, it was B. Well, you don't have any stopping point where you could say, so every aspect of what B is, I can now zoom in on and question the determinateness of what that ultimately is, right? Determinateness is never a final fact, right? So the determinate, but why do I say we still want a necessity there? That the real promissory note. So if someone could rewrite the logic backwards, right, and do all the deductions backwards, or maybe I'll assign a student to do this, start anywhere in the middle and then deduce everything in a random computer-generated random sequence, right? And I want them to be as convincing as the Hegelian ones, where some necessity is glimpsed there. The particularity then comes not from a single sequence, but because any starting point will have sort of initial conditions or parameters. Like right now I'm sitting at a desk, it's 9 in the morning, I've got coffee in here, there's certain sensations, I'm worried about this, I'm sleepy, blah, blah, blah. All those things constitute this moment. And when you speak concretely about the Tiantai business, they have this thing called the contemplation of the mind, of the deluded momentary mind, where that structure, this moment, serves, if I can put it this way, serves the role of the logical category. This moment of experience is now the thing from which spillovers, reconfigurations, resituating and of itself qua infinite is done, right? It doesn't exclude the sort of abstract logic form of it, but they would just say that's one way, that's one thing, and that belongs to the which provides a kind of brilliant model for how that same thing could be done to any determination you might want to raise. So everything has to be, that's why I had the convex concave cube. I want to say there's necessity because things have to fit together.
And you need a logic. because without it, it's one-sided. You need the absolute to have logical form. And
Yeah.
so that's why it's really important to say that, because otherwise it's the other side. Yeah.
Exactly. But I mean, but the point is, like, you can have an infinite number of logical forms, which is not the same thing as there being no logic. Because when you posit any one thing as determinate in this way, you are implicitly positing a concomitant set of other propositions you're committed
Actually,
to, right?
yeah, this is the other question that I wanted to ask you, that maybe just the last one, which is assumptions about determinacy. Because we often assume, and I'm not sure because I didn't see all the slides, and but it seems that determinacy is a relative notion here. That determinacy to be determinately this is to not be that. It's not clear to me that you're working with the notion of absolute determinacy.
Oh,
Like,
no, I want to say that well, this one is I skipped.
Yeah, so this is my question. Hegel has a concept of absolute determinacy, where you could say have the concept is not its other, but the other is itself. So it's not itself. So you have self-contradiction, self-negation. And that's, by my lights, the only good Hegelian defensible position is the absolute is the self-contradictory power that maintains itself as self-contradictory through every form. So that you do have a concept that maps onto the absolute, namely self-contradiction, and that's absolute determinacy. And it should have the non-conceptual and the conceptual in it, and you should be able to have an intersubsumption.
Exactly.
Flip it, like you say.
I mean, what you've just named is the three truths, right? Which is to say the contradiction is the middle, and the middle is the absolute, right?
That's my view.
And of course, yes, the conceptual and the non-conceptual, we have to, which lines that would go through would be really interesting to work through. I get that.
Yeah.
But about determination, I just want to say this is one of those skip slides was just to say, well, determination in quotes is itself a determination. Right. So when I say this thing is determinate, I'm making some claim about it, right? I'm opposing it to something else, i.e. being indeterminate. And so the nature of being like what it is to be determinate, it still falls to exactly the same critique, which is that it is not a self-standing thing. Right?
Yeah, see, that seems to be a fundamental dispute because Hegel thinks there is absolute determinacy. And I guess that's an interesting question is what's the relation of, right? I think just as an open question for thinkers, which is, can there be absolute determinacy? Or is that impossible?
Yeah.
And a lot hangs on that, actually. And we usually just assume that determinacy is relative. And when you have that assumption, of course, you're going to have the incompleteness and all of this. Like it's kind of, at least some kind of logical incompleteness, right? And so, it's just not obvious to me. But anyway, we're already running out of time. But maybe the last word, Brook, and any final words or?
No, I mean that last one is a can of worms, but
it's a can of worms. Yeah.
No, just thank you very much for this is great. I very rarely get to do this in this have enough time to at least get into this stuff a little bit. So I'm really glad, really grateful you invited me.
Yeah, I wish we had even more time, but I have to run to actually go see an old teacher. So got to jump in the car and travel the American way. Anyway, so look. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Brook, for coming, giving the talk. Thanks, everybody, for the questions and the discussion. I think really fruitful. A lot to think about over the next few days. So thanks so much. And thanks so much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.